The first real snow of November came sideways. It didn't fall, it attacked. Wind swept across the valley like a living thing, hurling needles of ice against the scattered cabins that dotted the hillside. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, struggling streams, twisting violently before vanishing into the gray sky. Inside the smallest cabin at the edge of the tree-line, Evelyn Harper stood beside her wood stove, arms crossed, listening. The wind found every weakness. It whistled through the window trim. It hummed beneath the door. It pressed against the log walls with a low, steady groan. The thermometer nailed beside the pantry door read 34 F. Inside, she fed another split log into the stove and shut the cast iron door with more force than necessary. Across the clearing, she saw her neighbor Caleb Dorsey stacking firewood in thick gloves. He shook his head toward her place, then laughed at something said by his brother Mason. They thought she was stubborn. They thought she was foolish. And in their defense, she had just ordered 2 pallets of corrugated sheet metal for a log cabin. In winter, word traveled faster than wind in Pine Hollow. By the time Evelyn's metal delivery arrived on a rattling flatbed truck, 3 neighbors had already stopped by just to check in. "You patching the roof?" Caleb asked, boots crunching in frost. "No," Evelyn said. "You building a shed?" "No." She handed the delivery driver a clipboard, signed her name, and watched the steel sheets thud onto the ground beside her cabin. "I'm wrapping the house." Silence. Mason let out a short laugh, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. "You'll turn it into an oven in summer," Caleb warned. "And an icebox now." Evelyn didn't argue. She had spent the previous winter waking up to frost forming along the interior log seams. She'd watched condensation freeze inside the walls and melt into dark, damp streaks by midday. Her firewood supply had nearly tripled compared to the year before. She had done the math. The logs weren't enough. The problem wasn't heat. The problem was movement. Evelyn hadn't grown up in Pine Hollow. She had grown up in northern Minnesota, in a farmhouse her father modified himself. He used to say, "Heat doesn't just escape. It gets pulled." Wind created pressure. Pressure pulled warmth through cracks. Logs expanded and contracted. Tiny air paths formed. She had spent nights reading building science manuals by lantern light, studying diagrams, watching lectures when her satellite connection allowed it. The concept was simple. Create a ventilated outer shell. Leave a gap. Stop wind from touching the structural wall. An air barrier without trapping moisture. A rainscreen system. Improvised. The metal wasn't insulation. The air behind it was. The first sheet went up crooked. She adjusted. She fastened vertical furring strips along the log exterior, spacing them carefully to create a consistent 1-inch air cavity. Neighbors slowed their trucks as they passed. Some waved. Some stared. By afternoon, the west-facing wall gleamed silver under the weak winter sun. Wind hit the metal and roared, louder now, but something was different. Inside the cabin, the stove didn't struggle as hard. The draft under the door felt weaker. The air inside didn't churn. Evelyn noticed it immediately. She said nothing. That night, temperatures dropped to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts reached 40 miles per hour. Caleb's porch thermometer froze solid. At 3 a.m., Evelyn woke out of habit and stepped onto the wooden floor, bracing for the bite of cold. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't sharp. She checked the thermometer beside the pantry. 41 degrees Fahrenheit. 7 degrees warmer than the night before. With less wood burned. She stood there in the dim, orange glow of embers, listening. The wind still screamed outside, but it no longer sounded like it was inside the walls. The air gap was working, and by morning, the valley would start asking questions. Hashtag Chapter 6, the temperature test. By sunrise, the valley felt different. Not warmer, just sharper. The kind of cold that made pine trees crack audibly as sap contracted inside their trunks. Evelyn stepped outside with a notebook and a handheld thermometer. 9 degrees Fahrenheit ambient air. She walked to the west wall, the one now covered in corrugated metal, and pressed the probe into the air cavity through a small gap she had intentionally left near the base. 18 degrees Fahrenheit. She moved inside and measured the interior log surface of that same wall. 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Last week, under similar conditions, it had measured 33 degrees Fahrenheit. That wasn't coincidence. That was control. Across the clearing, Caleb watched from his porch. By mid-morning, he walked over. "You measuring something?" he asked. "Yes." And she handed him the notebook. He scanned the numbers, frowned, then scanned them again. "That gap's staying warmer than the outside air. Wind can't strip the heat off the logs anymore," she said. "It hits the metal first." He looked at the wall again, not laughing this time. Word spread. By afternoon, Mason and two other neighbors stood near the cabin while Evelyn explained it like she would explain a recipe. "The logs store heat," she said, "but when wind hits them directly, it pulls heat away through convection." She pointed to the metal. "This stops direct wind contact. The air behind it warms slightly from heat escaping the cabin. Since the space is narrow, the air doesn't circulate fast. It slows down heat loss." "So it's insulation?" Mason asked. "No, it's protection from movement." She explained stack effect, pressure differences, wind washing, the way even tight log cabins leak air through micro gaps. They didn't understand every term, but they understood results. "Why metal?" someone asked. "Cheap, durable, non-absorbing. Snow slides off, and it creates a clean drainage plane." Caleb crossed his arms. "Won't moisture get trapped?" Evelyn shook her head. "The gap breathes at the top and bottom. Any condensation dries out." She had drilled vent slots beneath the eaves. She had thought it through. 3 days later, the valley faced its worst freeze of the season. -14 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusting past 50 miles per hour. Pipes froze in 2 cabins down the road. Caleb's back bedroom dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. At 2:30 a.m., Evelyn added 1 log to the stove. Just one. The cabin never dipped below 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the logs along the interior walls felt dry, not damp with hidden frost. In the morning, she stepped outside and noticed something else. The metal surface was coated in frost, not the logs. The moisture was condensing on the outermost layer, exactly where she wanted it. The system was working as a shield. The biggest difference wasn't the temperature. It was the quiet. Before the metal wrap, wind produced a hollow rumble inside the cabin walls, a low-frequency vibration that carried through the structure. Now, the noise was duller, contained. The metal took the impact. The air gap diffused it. Even during high gusts, the interior felt steady. That psychological shift mattered. Cold wasn't just physical. It was mental. When your walls sound like they're fighting the weather, you feel exposed. Evelyn didn't feel exposed anymore. She felt insulated from chaos. And the neighbors were noticing more than just warmth. They were noticing comfort. Caleb showed up again that weekend. "No jokes this time. I burned through half a cord in 4 days," he admitted. "You?" "Less than a quarter." He walked around her cabin slowly, studying the fasteners, the spacing, the vent gaps near the roofline. "You think this would work on mine?" Evelyn didn't smile. "I know it would." He nodded once. "Help me plan it?" She handed him a tape measure. By dusk, 2 cabins in Pine Hollow had chalk lines drawn across their exterior walls. By spring, half the valley would quietly install their own versions. And no one would mention the laughing. Because in places where winter tests pride as much as construction, results matter more than opinions. Caleb's cabin faced north. That made it the worst candidate for winter survival in Pine Hollow. It took the brunt of every Arctic front that funneled through the valley. Evelyn started with the west wall. "Always begin where the wind hits hardest," she said. They installed vertical furring strips over the logs, careful to keep spacing consistent. 1 inch. No more. No less. Caleb worked quietly. No teasing. No commentary. Just focus. By late afternoon, the first section of corrugated steel was fastened into place. The metallic surface reflected the pale sky like frozen water. When the wind picked up that evening, it struck Caleb's newly wrapped wall with a sharp metallic hum. Inside, something changed immediately. "The draft's gone," he muttered. Evelyn nodded. Pressure control. He didn't need further explanation. He could feel it. By the second week, Caleb began tracking his wood usage the same way Evelyn had. Before the metal wrap, nearly 10 logs per night during sub-zero wind. After wrapping 2 exterior walls, 6 logs. After wrapping all 4 logs. The numbers didn't lie. The stove burned steadier. The interior temperature fluctuated less. The overnight dips weren't as dramatic. And something unexpected happened. The cabin didn't overheat during sunny afternoons. Because the metal wasn't absorbing heat inward, it was separated by air. Solar gain stayed moderate. Thought it'd turn into a toaster, Mason admitted one evening while stepping inside. Instead, it felt balanced, stable, like a modern home disguised as a rustic one. February delivered a blizzard that shut down the county road for 3 days. Snow piled waist-deep against cabin doors. Drifts swallowed fence posts. Wind gusted past 60 miles per hour. The valley disappeared into white noise. Inside her cabin, Evelyn sat at the table with a lantern and a mug of coffee, listening to the storm slam into the metal skin. It sounded aggressive outside. Inside, it felt distant. She walked to the wall and placed her palm flat against the logs. Dry. No icy bite. No condensation forming in the seams. Across the clearing, Caleb later said something that stuck. For the first time since I built this place, he admitted, I wasn't worried. That was the real difference. Not just temperature, security. Not everyone converted. Old man Howard Green lived farther down the road, in a cabin he'd built 30 years ago by hand. No metal box for me. He grumbled when Caleb mentioned it. Wood breathes. Wood's natural. Evelyn didn't argue. 2 weeks later, Howard's pipes froze during a minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit snap. He spent an entire day thawing lines with a propane heater. The following morning, he drove his truck up the hill. He didn't mention pipes. He didn't mention cold. He just stood beside Evelyn's cabin and tapped the steel panel with his knuckles. How thick, he asked. 29 gauge. He nodded slowly. Help me measure. Sometimes pride only melts after plumbing does. By March, 5 cabins in Pine Hollow had exterior air gap metal systems. From a distance, the valley looked slightly different, flashes of silver between trees. But inside those homes, something fundamental had shifted. Firewood piles lasted longer. Walls stayed drier. Sleep came easier during windstorms. The laughter was gone. In its place was quiet respect, and a shared understanding that survival in harsh climates isn't about tradition alone. It's about adaptation. One evening, as the sun dipped behind snow-covered ridges, Evelyn stood outside and looked at the metal surface of her cabin. It had scratches now, a few dents from flying debris. But behind it, the logs were protected, preserved. The air gap had done more than stop the freeze. It had changed how the valley thought about winter. And winter, as always, was watching. When the snow finally began to retreat, Pine Hollow looked patched together. Dark, wet soil emerged in streaks. Rooflines dripped steadily. The river swelled and ran loud with meltwater. For the first time since installing the metal wrap, Evelyn removed a lower panel section to inspect the logs behind it. Caleb stood nearby, watching closely. The wood was dry. No mold streaking. No frost cracks. No soft spots. Just solid, intact timber. She ran her fingers along the surface and smiled faintly. The wall barely moved all winter, she said. No expansion stress from freeze cycles. Caleb nodded. That alone's worth it. Because in log construction, movement is damage. And damage compounds. The air gap hadn't just reduced heat loss. It had reduced structural strain. By June, the valley had shifted into green. And with warmth came the skeptics again. Just wait till August, Mason said. Metal's gonna cook you. But August came and brought dry heat in the high 80s. Inside Evelyn's cabin, the temperature stayed 8 to 10 degrees cooler than outside during peak sun. The reason was simple. The metal absorbed solar radiation, but the ventilated gap allowed rising hot air to escape upward, drawing cooler air from below, a chimney effect in reverse. The logs never absorbed direct solar load. Caleb tested it with an infrared thermometer. Bare log cabin wall, 112 degrees Fahrenheit surface temperature. Metal with air gap, 94 degrees Fahrenheit metal surface, 83 degrees Fahrenheit log surface behind it. Didn't see that coming, Mason admitted. Neither had most of the valley. By late summer, the hardware store in the nearest town stocked corrugated steel in bulk for the first time. The owner called it the Pine Hollow Order. What began as ridicule had turned into quiet adoption. But Evelyn noticed something deeper. The conversations had changed. Before, winter talk was about endurance. Who burned the most wood? Who survived the worst storm? Now it was about efficiency, planning, longevity. How long do you think the logs will last now? Caleb asked one evening. Decades longer, she said. Because protecting a structure from wind-driven moisture and temperature shock doesn't just improve comfort. It extends life. October returned faster than expected. The first hard frost coated the valley silver again. Evelyn stood outside at dusk, looking at the metal skin of her cabin. It reflected the pale sky, steady and quiet. She remembered the laughter, the sideways glances, the certainty in other people's voices when they said it wouldn't work. That night, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusted hard. Inside, the cabin held steady. She added 2 logs before bed. 2. She slept through the night without waking once. No groaning walls. No sharp drafts. No frost forming along seams. Just stillness. The kind that feels earned. By the second winter, no one in Pine Hollow laughed about metal anymore. Half the cabins now had some version of an air gap exterior system. Some used steel. Some used aluminum. One even experimented with charred wood cladding over battens. The valley looked subtly modern, but still rooted in tradition. One afternoon, a delivery driver passing through asked Caleb about the metal-wrapped cabins. "Why'd everyone switch?" he asked. Caleb glanced toward Evelyn's place. "Because she proved something," he said. "What's that?" "That sometimes the old way isn't wrong. It's just unfinished." Evelyn didn't set out to change the valley. She just wanted to stop the freeze from creeping into her walls. But the air gap had done more than block wind. It created space. Space between weather and home. Between opinion and outcome. Between tradition and improvement. And in that space, warmth stayed where it belonged. By the third winter, Pine Hollow wasn't as isolated as it used to be. A blogger from the city arrived in a 4-wheel drive SUV, camera mounted on the dashboard, chasing stories about off-grid innovation. He expected rugged individualism. He expected wood smoke and stubborn pride. What he didn't expect was steel. He parked near Evelyn's cabin and stepped out, boots crunching in packed snow. "You the one who started the metal wrap thing?" he asked. "I wrapped my cabin," she replied. Everyone else made their own decision. He circled the structure slowly, filming. "Doesn't it ruin the aesthetic?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the mountains rising behind her home. "I live in it," she said. "Not outside it." That answer made it into his article. The blogger's video spread faster than anyone anticipated. Within weeks, comments poured in from cold regions across the country. Alaska, Montana, northern Maine, the Dakotas. Some praised the simplicity. Some criticized the look. Some demanded proof. So Evelyn did something she hadn't planned on doing. She shared the data. 3 winters of wood consumption. Interior temperature averages. Moisture readings behind the wall. Surface temperature comparisons during summer heat. No exaggeration. No marketing. Just results. Caleb laughed when he saw the spreadsheet. You turn a cabin fix into a case study. She shrugged. If people are going to argue, give them numbers. By the 4th winter, variations of the Pine Hollow wrap appeared online. Some were smart. Some were dangerous. One homeowner sealed the bottom and top of the air cavity completely, trapping moisture. Another installed foam insulation tight against the metal, defeating the ventilation effect. Evelyn began answering emails at night, clarifying the principle. The gap must breathe. Water must drain. Air must move slowly, not stagnate. She emphasized one thing over and over. It's not about metal. It's about managing wind and moisture. The material was secondary. The air was primary. That distinction mattered. The 5th winter tested everything. Record-breaking cold. Minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit overnight lows. Sustained winds for days. Power lines went down across the county. Generators failed. Propane deliveries were delayed. In Pine Hollow, wood stoves glowed steadily. The metal skins rattled under gusts, but behind them, the logs held firm. Inside her cabin, Evelyn monitored temperatures with quiet focus. The lowest interior reading during the worst night? 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Above freezing. Without extraordinary fuel use. Caleb's cabin performed similarly. Even Howard Green, once the most vocal skeptic, admitted something while stacking wood outside. "I used to build against winter," he said. "Now I feel like I'm working with it. Because the air gap didn't fight the cold. It redirected it." Years passed. New cabins built in Pine Hollow incorporated ventilated exteriors from the start. Not all used steel. Some used fiber cement. Some used reclaimed barn tin. But every builder left space. 1 inch. Ventilated top and bottom. Drainage path intact. No one laughed anymore. The story faded into local memory, replaced by a simple understanding. Wind is more powerful than insulation. Moisture is more destructive than temperature. And small design shifts create large outcomes. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Evelyn stood at her window. The metal exterior caught flakes that melted and slid off quietly. Inside, warmth held steady. She remembered that first delivery day. The smirks, the sideways glances. Sometimes innovation doesn't look impressive. Sometimes it just looks different, until winter proves it right. It started as a Saturday gathering. Nothing formal. Just coffee, folding chairs, and a portable whiteboard set up inside Caleb's barn. But 23 people showed up. Some drove 2 hours. A contractor from northern Wisconsin. A couple restoring a 1970s log home. A retired engineer curious about airflow modeling. Evelyn stood in front of them, hands slightly dusty from helping Howard finish a corner trim piece that morning. She wasn't a lecturer. She wasn't selling anything. She just explained what she had learned the hard way. "Wind is invisible pressure," she said, drawing arrows on the board. "Pressure drives heat loss. If you interrupt the wind, you interrupt the loss." She sketched a cross-section. Metal cladding. 1-inch air gap. Vertical battens. Log wall. Water drains down. Air vents up. The logs stay dry. The temperature swing reduces. That's it. No hype. Just physics. By the end of the day, 3 attendees had already measured their own exterior walls and begun planning retrofits. The idea had moved beyond Pine Hollow. Late that winter, Evelyn received a handwritten letter from Montana. The writer, a woman named Claire Donnelly, described a remote cabin at 7,000 feet elevation. "Our first winter after installing a ventilated metal wrap," the letter read, "we used 30% less firewood. But more importantly, we didn't wake up to frozen interior wall seams." Claire included photos. Snow stacked high against steel siding. Icicles forming only along the outer surface. Dry, intact log interiors. At the bottom of the letter was one line. "Thank you for proving that small changes can outlast harsh weather." Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer beside her stove. She never intended to start anything. But something had started. One evening, years after that first winter, Caleb asked a question he'd never asked before. "Why didn't you just move?" he said. "Why not build something new?" Evelyn stared into the stove flames before answering. Because this cabin deserved to last. She had built it herself after her father passed away. Every log notched by hand. Every beam lifted with borrowed help. When the walls began frosting from the inside, it didn't feel like inconvenience. It felt like failure. The metal wrap wasn't about efficiency alone. It was about preservation, about respecting the structure enough to protect it properly. And sometimes protection doesn't look traditional. A decade after the first sheet of corrugated steel went up, Pine Hollow faced one of the strongest winter storms on record. Sustained winds above 70 miles per hour. Temperatures hovering near -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Whiteout conditions for nearly 48 hours. The valley disappeared under ice and noise. Metal cladding flexed, but held. Air gaps ventilated as designed. Logs behind the panels remained dry and stable. When the storm finally cleared, the damage across the valley was minimal. No collapse walls. No freeze split beams. No widespread pipe bursts. What once seemed radical had quietly become resilience. Howard Green, now slower but still sharp, summed it up best while leaning on his truck. "Turns out," he said, it wasn't about wrapping the cabin. He tapped the steel panel lightly. It was about giving the wind somewhere else to go. Years later, if you drive through Pine Hollow in winter, you'll notice something subtle. Cabins still look rustic. Smoke still curls from chimneys. Snow still blankets the roofs. But beneath the surface, nearly every structure now includes a deliberate gap. A narrow, intentional space between exterior skin and structural wall. An inch of quiet strategy. An inch that separates force from fragility. Cold from comfort. Weather from home. Evelyn still lives in the original cabin at the edge of the tree line. The metal has weathered slightly, softened in tone, marked by time, but it remains strong. Inside, the logs are dry. The stove burns steady. The temperature holds. No one laughs anymore, because winter always comes. And in Pine Hollow, they learned something simple. You don't defeat the cold by fighting harder. You defeat it by creating space. Space for air to slow. Space for water to drain. Space for warmth to stay. And sometimes, that single inch of space changes everything.